Prologue, my story. I'm a physician, board-certified specialist in rehabilitation. I was chief of the Kaiser Foundation Rehabilitation Center for 25 years. And in 1991, I was elected California Rehabilitation Physician of the Year. I conducted the acupuncture clinic for 20 years, the chronic pain and temporomandibular joint clinic for 18 years. I hope you're impressed by these accomplishments. But I forgot to mention something else. For 31 of my 38 professional years, I had a zealously guarded secret. I was a severe claustrophobic. So severe that at the height of my phobia, I was only safe at home and at the hospital. The only place I felt worthwhile was at the hospital. It was not uncommon for me to spend 100 hours a week there. I was always in. It all began my junior year at the University of California at Los Angeles. I was a pre-med major, under great stress to make grades. No one in my family had gone beyond high school. The family business was a failing hardware store, and thus the only hope for a better future was to do well academically. I simply decided in my freshman year to study harder than anyone else at the university. I studied 6 to 8 hours every day, including weekends. I made Phi Eta Sigma and Phi Beta Kappa, both Scholastic Achievement Societies. Then one day, I walked into my third year Shakespeare class with no idea that events in the next few minutes would devastate my life for the next 31 years. Moments after I sat down, my heart began to pound. I was having trouble breathing. My hands were sweaty and cold. My mouth became numb. I experienced severe abdominal cramping and discomfort and severe bowel urgency, as if I were going to have a bowel movement. I felt if I didn't leave that room, I would die. I was terrified. I literally ran from the room. Incredibly, I entered that room, a normal human being, and left a severe claustrophobic. Actually, that's a lie. I wasn't normal. I was extremely shy in high school, and shyness is a phobic manifestation. I was awesomely sensitive and overly responsible, more indications of a phobic predisposition. My hands shook if I lit a girl's cigarette, a form of scriptophobia, an inability to write without trembling if being observed. I was born to have an anxiety disorder. Unknowingly, I was a walking phobic time bomb, and that bomb exploded that morning in class. Unfortunately, for the next 31 years, I never ventured anywhere without worrying about having another of those anxiety attacks. I calmed down for my next class, but made 3 crucial mistakes that guaranteed the persistence of my anxious symptoms. Instead of going to the student health service, I chose not to tell anyone. I was afraid they would think I was crazy and would notify medical schools about my condition, thus wasting 3 years of scholastic work. I decided not to tell anyone. Second, I went to the bathroom prior to entering my next class just to make sure I didn't have a bowel accident. And third, I sat at an aisle seat closest to the door so I could leave easily. I followed those same patterns for the next 31 years, guaranteeing the persistence and maintenance of my phobic fears. Everything I was doing was rehearsing my fears. Unfortunately, once a phobia begins, it has a life of its own. It increases in scope. A phenomenon I would later find out is called generalization. It began in a classroom, but soon spread to restaurants, theaters, buses, freeways, bridges, parties, courtrooms, and planes. Any situation wherein I did not have an immediate escape or access to a bathroom. Phobics have target organs, bodily systems that express their anxiety. Some have cardiorespiratory symptoms like chest pain, rapid heart rate, and shortness of breath, concerns about heart attacks and strokes. Others have cerebral symptoms, dizziness, lightheadedness, a feeling of detachment and dissociation, and they worry about brain tumors, multiple sclerosis, or going insane. My target organs were my bowels and my stomach. When I got anxious, I felt severe abdominal pain and nausea and a sense of bowel urgency. My greatest fears were that I would vomit in public or have a bowel accident. Again, for the next 31 years, I chose behaviors to avoid these two fears, and again, reinforced and perpetuated them. I never ate before lectures, and I ate only turkey breast and mashed potatoes with white gravy before social events, because they would look less offensive if I threw up. I avoided red sauces, thinking that would look like blood. Eating turkey and mashed potatoes, I would learn, were subtle neutralizations that only reinforced my phobic fear. My world began to shrink. Anything I did was accomplished at a high level of anxiety. I had great difficulty going anywhere away from home, agoraphobia. Nevertheless, I married, but never told my wife about my phobia. I was accepted to the prestigious University of California at San Francisco Medical School and performed well. Medical school in those days was conducted like a Marine boot camp. The first morning, a Nobel Prize laureate welcomed us and informed us that there were 5 students waiting out there for one of us to stumble. If that happened, we would be summarily flunked out of school. We were given a 300-page reading assignment that night and informed there would be a test the next morning. I went home, threw up, and studied until 5 a.m., then took a 3-question test that was not graded. Surprise. Things never changed. The homework was daily and lengthy. I was rooming with 4 other freshman medical students, and all we did was study. It was a competition to see who could stay up the longest. The one who went to bed before 3 a.m. was probably first. The first semester included one primary class, human anatomy. 4 students were randomly assigned to one cadaver and virtually dissected it from head to toe. Gray's Human Anatomy was our 8-pound, 1,400-page Bible that was to be learned from cover to cover. Every waking school moment, weekends too, were devoted to that study. It didn't take too much imagination to realize the importance of test scores in that class. There would be a midterm and a final that comprised 80% of the grade. It was rumored that the bottom 5% would flunk out. The midterm was announced. A 3-hour, 50-question practicum. Each of the 20 cadavers would have areas marked with arrows or colored string indicating parts to be identified anatomically. There were rumors circulating that in the past, cutthroat students would move the arrows or strings so that those who followed would answer incorrectly. It was part of the lore, but added to the prevailing stress. One way I coped with stress was to be comedic. I have to this day a perverse sense of humor. I would be the only one on the cadaver team telling sacrilegious jokes, not about the cadaver, but medical school, professors, and the absurdity of our academic burden. That was my reputation, comic. As such, I wasn't taken too seriously, and from a phobic standpoint, that was good. I could fade into the woodwork. Nobody would notice. As test day approached, study hours increased. It wasn't uncommon to study the entire night, staggering off to school the next morning and catching a few winks when the lights went out for slide projections. The night before the test, no one slept. My roommate decided to do some additional studying from a German anatomy text and was asking the questions that weren't covered in our English texts. We concluded he was a genius and would score higher than anyone in the class. Test day arrived. We were lined up one by one to enter the anatomy lab. The mood was as somber as a funeral. No one spoke. Professors and assistants carefully observed the test takers to make sure no one cheated. Touching the exhibits was forbidden. At the conclusion, the participants acted as if they'd been let out of solitary confinement. Indeed, we had. We had gravitated to our favorite beer pub and spent our yearly allowance. We reviewed various questions, shaking heads in disbelief when the answers given didn't coincide with our own. It was a consensus that indeed we had all flunked. 2 weeks later, midterm scores were posted outside the dean's office. 80 eager students descended en masse to the grading spectacle. When I was 8 or 10 people from the wall, I heard someone say, "Who is Liebgold?" "I don't know," someone else answered. When it was my turn, I looked at the posted list of 80 names arranged in order of score. At the top was Liebgold, H. I knew then I belonged. My roommate, he He scored in the middle of the pack. He was overprepared. He closed his German text and studied only English for the rest of the semester. But my cover was blown. Phobic or not, I could no longer hide behind a veil of anonymity. Professors dropped by our table to compliment me. Our anatomy assistant shared in my accomplishment and beamed that one of hers had gotten the top grade. The pride I felt didn't change my phobic concern. I was preoccupied with the fear of having a panic attack and being deemed as weak, ineffective, and blemished. I continually fed my claustrophobic fears by sitting on an aisle seat near the exit and never went to class without first going to the restroom. People always ask how I could have been anxious for so many years. I wasn't anxious all that time. I avoided any anxiety-provoking situations. You see, I could hide nicely behind my academic responsibilities. I didn't have to go many places because I was either studying or on call. Phobics can always find a way to avoid discomforts. Later, I had 3 children, another wonderful way for agoraphobics to hide. Initially, just taking care of them, and later taking them to parks, open areas with lots of restrooms. Even as a physician, I was relatively unencumbered. Only in meetings would I experience anxiety. But if I got too anxious, I could pretend my beeper went off. I would go to the nearest phone and complete an imaginary consultation. I would then leave to go see a patient, my secret safe, for another day. But my level of anxiety gradually escalated until I was continuously fearful that I would be found out. I finally admitted I needed help. Even though I was a Kaiser physician and eligible for free psychiatric care, I opted to go elsewhere for therapy so no peers would see me going into the Kaiser psychiatric unit. We had only a brief introduction into psychiatry in my medical training. It was all Freudian and psychoanalysis was held in very high regard. I was a doctor and had the money. Surely psychoanalysis would cure me. I found a therapist who would see me at night after work. I didn't tell my wife about my phobia, but since I almost never left the hospital before 7 p.m., I could attend therapy unnoticed. I went for 11 months, spent close to $17,000, and at the end of the therapy, though I felt a little better, my phobia was unchanged. I didn't know then that Freud, the father of psychology, was a travel phobic and couldn't attend his own mother's funeral. I also didn't know that psychoanalysis, or even psychodynamic talk therapy, was not an appropriate primary treatment for phobias and obsessions. This is not psychiatry bashing. The techniques in use today simply were not available then. Several other times in those 31 years, when I was in crisis, I again sought outside psychiatric care. The most devastating event came when my oldest son, a brilliant student, in the top 0.05% in SAT scores, a straight A student throughout high school and college, took his own life. He was an undiagnosed agoraphobic who was also receiving inappropriate psychotherapy. He had dropped out of school because of increasing anxieties and took a fatal dose of poison. I had barely heard the term agoraphobia and couldn't appreciate the depths of his avoidant pain. I was devastated. The outcome of all my psychiatric ventures was the same. They helped to deal with the acute crisis, that is, death and divorce, but my phobias remained unchanged. I concluded that I would never be cured. I would realize later that all phobics share this same depressing myth. I decided to follow my son's path and took up a new hobby, pistol shooting. My intent was to commit suicide to finally be free from the incessant pain. I had obsessed on suicide in the past. Once, in a third-year medical class, I drew a picture of the Golden Gate Bridge with an arrow leading to the water. My dilemma was that if I killed myself, my death had to appear accidental. Absurdly, like most phobocs, I was concerned about what people would think. The famous WWPTs we'll talk about later. As such, I purchased a .22 caliber target pistol. If you buy a .357 Magnum and put that in your mouth, everyone would know your intent. I decided to make a beautiful wooden carrying case for the pistol. No one would waste their time on such a project if they were going to kill themselves. It surely must have been an unfortunate accident. I always look back and wonder why I didn't pull the trigger. Incredibly, it wasn't a lack of courage or a sense of parental responsibility. I was afraid I might miss, become paralyzed, and end up a patient in my own rehab center, unable to run from my claustrophobic fears. And so I carried on, one difficult day at a time. Things came to a head in 1983. My surviving son wanted to go to the 1984 Olympic Games in Los Angeles. To a claustrophobic, afraid of crowds, the Olympics would be a living hell. They were talking about 2 million visitors. The freeways would be so crowded, they would become parking lots. Things claustrophobics love to hear. Even that year's telephone directory had a picture of a packed Olympic stadium on the front cover. Every time I saw that picture, I knew I could not handle that crowd. Every newspaper carried articles about the expected transportation difficulties. My only hope was that one article reported that so many people were applying for tickets to the opening event that there would be only one chance in 4,500 to obtain tickets. I told my son in advance that I would mail the application, but I doubted we would get tickets. Whew. In October 1983, I received a congratulatory letter from the Olympic Committee stating that I had indeed won 2 tickets to the July 1984 Olympic Games opening ceremony. 9 months in advance, I had a severe panic attack because I knew I would not be able to handle the situation. I was still in a very high level of anxiety the next day when I was presented 2 subpoenas at work. As chief of a large rehabilitation center, my patients who had been catastrophically injured often filed lawsuits. Again, courts were very confining and difficult for me. I always felt trapped in them. In 25 years, I never received 2 subpoenas in one day. These were big cases involving big companies for millions of dollars. Big and millions increased my anxiety greatly. I barely could get through the day. I had a surreal feeling of weightlessness and detachment. I thought I might explode. My mind was racing. How could I get out of these obligations? I was frantic. I couldn't see a way out. Should I use that target pistol now? I was never closer to ending my life. I don't know whether you believe in God or a universal spirit, but my God, who because of my perverse sense of humor resembles Mel Brooks, said, "Howie, you better watch the 10 o'clock news." That night, there was a segment on our local TV news about a group in nearby Lafayette who claimed phenomenal success with phobias. They mentioned the name of the organization, but it was an abbreviation, and I didn't know how to spell it. There is a famous Chinese proverb, when a student is ready, a teacher will appear. I was very ready. Fortunately, there was a follow-up article the next morning in our local newspaper. TERAP, short for Territorial Apprehension, that is agoraphobia. I'm going to have terrible trouble writing this next sentence as the tears are flowing, as they always do when I recall this moment. I called first thing in the morning and scheduled an intake interview for that afternoon. For the first time in 31 years, I was told what I had were panic attacks and agoraphobia, and that they were curable. I had never heard these words before. I enrolled in their 16-week class, but read all the course materials and the 3 recommended supplemental texts the first weekend. I could not sleep. For the first time, there was hope and a path. 4 weeks later, I was 95% better. 4 weeks. That is 8 hours of instruction. I was 95% better. In 4 weeks, I was sitting in a movie theater, watching The Natural, tears cascading down my cheeks, not because Robert Redford had just hit a home run, but because for the first time in 31 years, many, many more tears, I was sitting in the middle of a row and not in an aisle seat without anxiety. Incredibly, for 31 years, I was 8 hours away from being helped. Not 11 months of psychoanalysis, 8 hours of teaching. All those years bordering on the brink of suicide and alcoholism. Although doctors don't become alcoholics, we become wine connoisseurs. However, the glass got bigger and the brew got fresher, and I knew if I continued, I would be an alcoholic. I didn't care. I'd found at least one way to get that fist out of my stomach. That day, I stopped wine tasting and decided to sell my pistol, the one with the exquisite case. I knew I didn't need them anymore. The therapy was working. There was more than hope. there was success and the promise of a cure. That last word always does it. A few more tears. I came home and wrote a fairy tale, The Faux Boo, about a young man named Howie and how he slew his boo monster. The manuscript, like this one, was soaked in tears. I have never been able to read or discuss these events, or that story, even 20 years later, without the torrential outpouring of tears. I couldn't even proofread it dry. I'd gotten my life back. In the next weeks, I systematically attacked every phobic fear that I had. Victory after victory piled up. I took rapid transit. I rode elevators. I flew. I dated for the first time in 3 years since my divorce. I ate in restaurants, ate Mexican food, went to shows. I gave talks without fear. I gave depositions. I gave court testimony. I've now gone on over 35 cruises and traveled to 50 countries. None before my cure. I couldn't go on cruise ships because they closed their doors and sail away from port. Airplanes, too, have that same routine. Closing doors meant I was trapped, and that simply was not tolerable. I lived my very constrictive but safe existence for 31 years. I never thought I would wake up in the morning without apprehension, knowing that I could handle whatever came along that day. It was called peace of mind. In July of 1984, I attended the Olympic Games in Los Angeles, sat 35 seats from the aisle with my son, with 2 million visitors, with freeways jammed bumper to bumper without anxiety. I don't have to mention the tears I shed that day, but 3 reservoirs overflowed and the 2-year drought was resolved. I realized that I had a new mission. I would devote my entire professional life to teaching others how to overcome their fears and obsessions. I realized that what I was doing all those years was learning about how to cure anxiety disorders. I had become the world's authority on the topic because now, 20 years and 15,000 patients later, I always brag to my classes, I never met a patient who had a symptom I didn't have. In 31 years, I had them all. Now I know those years weren't wasted. I had always been told I had a unique gift for organizing and teaching, and now I applied those skills to create my own phobies classes. I am a voracious reader, and while I was going through my phobic cure, I read every article on anxiety, phobia, and obsessions written in the previous 10 years. I combined that with my personal phobic experiences and a multitude of human growth and development seminars, and created the first phobies class in October of 1984. Armed with an array of unique props like rubber brains, rubber monsters, a brain bag, squirt guns, squeak hammers, marshmallows, magic wands, and t-shirts with pertinent messages, I entered the foray. I used these props to drive home the phobies principles. What's unique about phobies is it treats the entire anxiety spectrum in large, mixed anxiety classes. So whether you worry excessively, have panic attacks, phobias, obsessions, or post-traumatic stress disorder, the phobies principles will work for you. I view phobics as wounded birds, limited in social skills. So what is needed in order to cure any anxiety disorders is life skills training added to a conventional curriculum, assertiveness, conversational and arguing skills, and even dance lessons. At the first class, 16 frightened patients sat in a circle and used a 32-page photocopied manual. While it may not be reassuring to hear how one frightened doctor cured his phobia, 20 years later, 160 pages added to the manual, and 15,000 successful graduates should be enough to convince you. If you do the phobies work, you will cure. 15,000 patients should be able to tell you that all phobias and obsessions are curable. Please believe.